I am muted, thank you. I just wanted to say welcome everyone and good evening. Thank you for joining us on this panel on racial economic inequities, past and present. I think that conversations like this are super important, but even more important in the age of disinformation and misinformed opinions. So I look forward to today's discussion with three of our faculty members. I'm going to do some brief introductions and then pass it over to Professor McMurtry-Chubb, who is moderating today's conversation. So starting with Professor Olken, he joined the faculty in 1989. He teaches American legal history, constitutional law 1 and 2, and learning skills. Prior to joining the John Marshall faculty, Professor Olken practiced business law with a small Boston law firm. He also served as a litigation associate with large firms in Los Angeles and New Jersey. Professor Olken's primary research interests are constitutional history and judicial biography. Welcome, Professor Olken. Next to Professor Hatcher. She is a human rights and community development lawyer. She's an assistant professor of law and director of the Community Enterprise and Social Solidarity Economy Clinic here at the law school. Prior to joining UIC John Marshall Law School, Professor Hatcher taught in Community Development Clinic at the University of Baltimore School of Law and served as a postdoctoral appointment at the University of Texas Austin's Institute for Urban Policy, Research and Analysis. Thank you, Professor Hatcher. And to our moderator, Professor MC. She researches, teaches, and writes in the areas of critical rhetoric, discourse, and genre analysis and legal history. She has lectured nationally on structural discrimination in educational institutions and the workplace, and is a leader in designing curricula to facilitate diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. She joined the faculty here in 2020 and currently teaches LS1 and critical race feminism. Thank you so much for moderating this important conversation.
All right, so I hope everyone is doing well this evening on this blissfully balmy day in Chicago. And so how we're going to do things is as follows. So I'm going to briefly outline some of the history dealing with the racial wealth gap. And then I'm going to turn it over to Professor Olken, who's going to give us his remarks about discrimination and discriminatory policies in education, and then turn it over to Professor Hatcher, who's going to talk to us about gentrification and community development. So without further ado, let's get started. So as I said, I'm going to just kind of give you an outline of the policies historically, and then, just kind of like a brief overview of how they've operated to bring us to this present point where we are in history. So we have the consistent and dual removal of indigenous peoples from their land, coupled with the transatlantic slave trade. And so it's important to understand that these things worked in tandem with each other, and that sometimes, large groups of indigenous people were divested of their land at the same time as captured Africans are being trafficked in trade. And how do the two go together, you might ask? Well, where do you think those enslaved Africans worked? On the land that was stolen from indigenous peoples. So even though England ends their participation in the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, it continues to flourish, and over 11 million Africans are captured and trafficked in trade. In 1830, we have the Indian Removal Act, which is the culmination of American policy with respect to indigenous peoples that had been going on since time immemorial. The 1830 Indian Removal Act is probably, if you know about it, you probably remember it most poignantly from the Trail of Tears, right? Where we have the Georgia tribe of, now they're known as the Georgia tribe of Eastern Cherokee, marched to Oklahoma and lands where they settled. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is also important to understand how people of color are divested of land, and then this land is given to non-people of color. So 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed after 2 years of protracted war with Mexico, the US war with Mexico, the Mexican-American War. And think about this, almost effectively overnight, all of the areas that we consider present day Utah, California, Arkansas, New Mexico, all of these states, right, that we think of as the Southwest, they were Mexico. And then overnight, they turned into the United States. And so there were Mexicans living on the land, obviously, people who had owned land. And although the US promised to protect their land rights after the treaty, they did not. So, either automatically or through policy, they were systematically divested of their land. And that land, again, was given to people who weren't of color. And as with most things I'm going to talk about throughout this little outline here, that the assertion of property rights was backed up by violence. So from the time the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, we have, reports of, upwards of 40 Mexican men who were lynched over their land. And they were lynched by white mobs, right? So this is always reinforced by the show of force. The transatlantic slave trade, extremely violent, indigenous removal violent, and now we have the forcible removal of indigenous and Mexican people from their land, also violent. In 1862, we've got the Homestead Act, which was passed by Abraham Lincoln on May 20th, 1862. And under this act, 160 acres of public land were available if you improved on it and paid a registration fee. So 1862 is a funny date because we're still in the middle of the Civil War, right? And one of the conditions of owning this land under the Homestead Act was that you could have not borne arms against the United States government. So you might say, oh my goodness, wait a minute, let me recalibrate my thinking here. Well, it gets better because the planter class largely paid poor whites to go and fight in the Civil War for them, which means that they were still eligible technically for land grants, even though they owned the majority of the land. And under the Homestead Act, 270 million acres of land were dispersed by the government to overwhelmingly white persons. You might have heard of the term 40 acres and a mule, Special Field Order number 15 issued by Sherman in 1865 to allot 40 acres to some freed families. Remember now 1865, we're coming into the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution that officially ended slavery. But when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson takes office and reverses that. So no more 40 acres and no mule. Then we have the rise of Jim Crow and the rise of the KKK. So again, this extrajudicial violence and coupled with segregation that is wreaking havoc on the lives of Black people in the country. Lynching reaches a fever pitch in the early 20th century. Congress failed to pass an anti-lynching bill despite the valiant efforts of Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was an anti-lynching activist and a journalist. If you are familiar with the Equal Justice Initiative and their National Memorial for Peace and Justice, this is a memorial that is rather recent for the victims of lynchings. So they went through the South and they documented how many people had been lynched. And again, lynchings were usually the result of just a reaction to Black business growth, a reaction to Black wealth and Black excellence, but were often couched in terms or the impetus was blamed on, well, there was this Black man and he assaulted a Black woman or white woman, excuse me, a Black man who looked at a white woman wrong, a Black woman who was alleged to have sexually assaulted a white woman. And later these accounts were found out not to be true, that the lynching was the result of Black business growth, Black excellence. And this is what Ida B. Wells was writing about. In 1919, the Chicago riot takes off. 1919 was the source of lots of riots across the country, but I thought I'd talk about the Chicago riot since this is where we are. This was the result of the migration of many Blacks from the South fleeing the Jim Crow South, fleeing the violence of the KKK. And so they come into Chicago and they're competing for jobs at the stockyards and the meatpacking plants. The riot leads to 38 dead, 537 injured, and approximately 2,000 people lost their homes. The overwhelming majority of those dead, injured, and homeless were Black. There were numerous riots and massacres across the country in the early 20th century. I'm just going to highlight a few. One is the 1920 Oconee Massacre, which occurred in Oconee, Florida, which is near Orlando. 30 to 35 Black people were killed for attempting to vote. In 1921, we have the Tulsa Race Massacre. This is a massacre that occurred over 2 days on allegations that a Black man assaulted a white woman. Throughout the course of the massacre, 35 blocks of Black businesses were destroyed in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, an area known as Black Wall Street. And over the course of those 2 days, 300 people died or were murdered, I should say. There were over 800 hospital admissions, and 6,000 African Americans from the Greenwood district were interned. So you think about the Japanese internment, you think about Jewish concentration camps. Well, these 6,000 African Americans were interned over a period of days. As a result of these riots. About 10,000 Black people were left homeless, and property damage amounted to more than $1.5 million in real estate, and $750,000 in private property damage. So this is the area known as Black Wall Street and has such a huge concentration of wealth. In 2020, the descendants filed a lawsuit. So lawsuit's now pending on the Tulsa massacre on an unjust enrichment theory. And most people had never heard about the Tulsa massacre until they tuned into HBO to watch The Watchmen, right? But this is something that predates that. Also, the 1923 Rosewood Massacre in Levy County, Florida. Again, allegations of assault of a white woman by a Black man. Official reports state that 27 people were dead, although eyewitnesses placed the casualties at over 100. And you're going to see this, right, constantly with historical accounts coming, that people have various accounts of what happened. But the survivors, I tend to believe them, they placed the casualties at over 100. I wanted to contrast this with another free Black town that is near and dear to my heart, and that is Chubbtown. My name is Teri McMurtry-Chubb. My husband's name is Mark Chubb. His family, he has the heritage of Chubbtown, which was established in 1864 as a colony of free African Americans, although the Chubbs come on the scene in 1775 as free Blacks in the South. Chubbtown still exists. It was a port of trade, not port, but I guess because it wasn't near water, but you get my meaning. It was like a trade hub in northern Georgia. It had its own post office, foundry, all of these things, chapel. And I mentioned Chubbtown because this is an example of what happens with Black sustainability and wealth when there isn't any white violence. So Chubbtown, like I said, was never burned. The people there were not the subject of lynchings. And such stability and acquisition of wealth was possible that you now have 2 NFL draft picks, Nick Chubb and Bradley Chubb, who were, played in the NFL. You have my own father-in-law, who is a self-sufficient business owner, one of the most prominent business owners in northern Georgia. And so this is what happens when Black people are left alone and able to work the land and able to build wealth through their families, through the legal schemes that were set up for property in this country. Then we move into, their false political narratives that ignore all of this history and talk about the so-called over-dependency of Black people. And they don't talk about any of the violence that has occurred to stop Black people from owning property, acquiring wealth through the schemes that are set up that others are able to take advantage of. And then lastly, there are barriers to home ownership. And Dorothy Brown, she's a critical race tax scholar, writes about this. where, for Black people to walk into a bank to get a home loan, extremely difficult. You saw this in 2008 with the subprime mortgage market, right? Marketing to Black and brown communities. And also, once Black people do acquire homes and are able to own homes, their homes are not worth as much. They're not able to have as much wealth acquisition through the ownership of those homes for several reasons. And I'll just highlight two. One is because Black people tend to want to live where other Black people live, and those property values are depressed usually. And when I say depressed, I don't mean that, you're living in a poor area. You can live like what comes to my mind immediately is living in Atlanta, and you could be in a completely Black gated millionaire community, but that Black gated millionaire community is going to be completely different than the white gated millionaire community. The values of those homes are going to be less. And I'm thinking about the Chris Rock skit a while ago where he's like, he lived next to a dentist. Like this was the height of his, he thought he had made it. And like he's living next to a dentist who's just rolling on being a dentist, didn't do anything famous. He's not like the funniest dentist, right? But Chris Rock is able to acquire with his wealth what the average white dentist is able to acquire. So I'll leave, I hope I gave you some food for thought, and I'll turn it over now to Professor Olken.
Thank you, Teri. Before I talk a little bit about affirmative action, I think to sort of provide some continuity, I want to touch a little bit upon the broader historical themes and perspective here, because I think it also will give you some idea as to why affirmative action is so necessary in our society today. If you look at the course of American history, one way to do this is to look at it as a series of constitutional revolutions. We've really had three constitutional revolutions in our country's history. The first being the American Revolution, and then extending into the time of the creation of the Constitution, the Civil War and Reconstruction, and then our last one was the New Deal era. And the one thing that a common denominator of all of these three revolutions is that persons of color have largely been ignored or shunted or put to the side. So if you look at, for example, the American Revolution and the founding of our country, the Constitution has about 16 references, either implicit or explicit, that talk about slavery. And so it's sort of, it would have been an opportunity at that time to address the issue head on. But the framers' generation decided not to do it. They decided to perpetuate it, and they decided in part to sort of kick the can down the road, hoping the next generation would do it. But that made things even worse. And then you get to the second revolution, and that's the Civil War and Reconstruction. And that Reconstruction is a misnomer, because Reconstruction would have been a perfect time for this country to reassess the original sin of slavery, to basically address the fact that slavery wasn't simply an economic system, but that it was just out and out racism. And they didn't do that. They had that opportunity. So even in the drafting, for example, of the 14th Amendment, they waffled on what did the term equal protection mean? Did it mean, were they talking about political rights? Were they talking about social rights? It's not surprising, because in the city in which the drafting of the 14th Amendment occurred, Washington, D.C., they had segregated schools. This didn't seem to bother anybody. They didn't address that opportunity at all. And then in the aftermath of Reconstruction, the early Supreme Court cases that tried to interpret the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, there are cases that where people would say, well, this is a badge and incidence of slavery, and they take a strict interpretation of the language, excuse me, the 13th Amendment says nothing about the badges and instances of slavery. You're either enslaved or you're not. They could have had the opportunity to really reconstruct the country, and they didn't do that. And then in the last revolution, which basically has given us the modern administrative state, one of the central pieces of legislation there was the Wagner Labor Relations Act, which was enacted in 1935. There was an ideal opportunity for them to amend versions of that act to address racially discriminatory practices in hiring, and they they flat out decided not to do that. And the reason they decided not to do that is because in order to get that piece of legislation through Congress and then signed by the president, you would need the Southern segregationists in the South to agree to that. And they were never going to agree. They were never going to agree to that if that legislation had been drafted in a way to address basically the out and out racism that was occurring. For example, yes, it helped the union movement, but what people sometimes don't understand is that if you were Black and a laborer, you weren't going to get into those unions. And so what happens is that over time, it seems like we're making progress as a country, but things are actually ossifying when it comes to race relations. And you might say, well, what does all this have to do with affirmative action? Well, 100 years after Reconstruction was sort of formally ended in the dirty deal of 1876, 1978, the United States Supreme Court for the first time addressed affirmative action in the Bakke decision. And one of the interesting things about that decision is it was a plurality opinion, and the court never reached a firm agreement about the appropriate standard of review. But they sent messages, and one of the messages that was sent, particularly in Justice Powell, who wrote the plurality opinion, was that you can construct an affirmative action program in the context of higher education that's grounded in the First Amendment. And why do you think, and why is that important? Because the First Amendment is in part about acquiring knowledge and the right to know and the right to express yourself. And when you think of places of higher education, there's not only, we call them bastions of learning, but more importantly, they're supposed to be places where people can exchange ideas from all backgrounds, and places to learn what you don't know about other people. And what Justice Powell was doing was he was suggesting you could, in part, construct an affirmative action program in a way that was to promote inclusion and not simply racial balancing. Anything that looks like racial balancing is going to be struck down as an impermissible quota in violation of the Equal Protection Clause. So the more successful cases that have come before the Supreme Court, and the one that instantly comes to mind is the University of Michigan Law School case, Grutter, where by then the court had decided that strict scrutiny would be the appropriate standard of review. But they had also become more comfortable with arguments where it was important to diversify, whether you're talking about faculties or whether you're talking about student bodies, in large part based on this First Amendment, the right to acquire knowledge, the right to express oneself, to basically have a community where learning is the priority, and realizing that the richest communities are those that are the most diverse, and that the strength of a university is largely based on who comprises that community. Now, the arguments on the other side tend to be, oh, they're highly paternalistic. For example, Justice Thomas, who on the Supreme Court has been probably the most outspoken opponent of affirmative action, has always said, well, it's very paternalistic, and he's thinking about his days, for example, at Yale Law School, where he has said that he felt that he was a token, and that he was only there because of his skin color. And interestingly, in his dissenting opinion in Grutter, he cites Frederick Douglass, of all people, and Frederick Douglass had said repeatedly throughout his career as an abolitionist that white people should leave blacks alone. We're fine. We don't need your help. And Clarence Thomas was taking that position. He's like, affirmative action is basically putting a stamp of inferiority on its supposed beneficiaries. But with all due respect to Justice Thomas, I think he may be missing the bigger picture here, because the importance, from my perspective, and again, in this kind of format, I think have more freedom to give my perspective, and don't have to be as measured perhaps as I would in the classroom. The older I get, the more interaction I have with students, particularly students from backgrounds different from mine, the more experience I have as a teacher, and just as the older as I get as a human being, the more and more convinced I am that affirmative action in higher education is an absolute necessity. If there's one thing that we haven't basically addressed, is we haven't addressed those hard conversations that people from different races and ethnicities have to have with one another. And the ideal place to do that, if it's not done in the lower schools, is done in higher education. And I'm not talking about racial balancing. I'm not talking about basically making sure you have a critical mass. What you want is you want an atmosphere where people realize how little they learn, how little that they know what they think they knew about going in. And the only way to do that is to have frequent and constant contact with people from different backgrounds. That's the only way, and especially in a law school, my God, it's the most important thing is that you have as diverse a background as possible, because you're going to be lawyers one day and you're going to represent people from all different segments of society. And lawyers basically are an important cog in moving the society forward. And how can you do that if you're just seeing the same old, and just looking at things from a particular perspective? So the way I see affirmative action is I see affirmative action as an important stepping stone in helping us become a more perfect union, in helping in moving us forward in ways that, left to our own devices, we're going to just do the same old. And perhaps I think the most compelling argument in favor of affirmative action is that if you don't do anything, you're going to have the same patterns of systemic discrimination be repeated over and over again. Opponents of affirmative action say, well, wait a second, that's discrimination. In fact, ironically, they will invoke Brown versus Board of Education, and they will say, oh my God, this is you are doing what the court said was wrong in Brown versus Board of Education. And they again are missing the boat. The old flu vaccines had bits of the flu in them. And the reason they had bits of the flu in them were basically to address the problem, to address people's compromised immune systems, to build up that immunity. If we're going to basically become a post-racial society, you better take race into consideration, because if you don't take race into consideration, you're basically not addressing the problem. So some people say, well, wait a second, why don't we just become more diversified just by taking socioeconomic factors into consideration? That will only get you so far. That's a part of the problem, but it's not the entire problem. There's a difference between being poor and being basically a person who's Black or Hispanic or Asian or American Indian. When you're walking down the street, the first thing that somebody's going to look at is they're going to look at what you look like, not how much money's in your wallet. Now, they may treat you differently when they know how much money you have or don't have, but it's very important that you take that race be taken into consideration, because otherwise you're never going to address the problem. Now, we're now at this, we heard all summer, we're at an inflection point, right? And this is a time when we're supposed to be thinking about this and perhaps moving forward. But here's something that should make us sort of pause. The composition of the Supreme Court has changed, and it has changed in a way that is more likely to try to really chip away at cases like Fisher and cases like Grutter, that have basically come out and said, yes, as long as there's a holistic, individualized analysis, race certainly should be a factor in admissions decisions. And that's something that we need to consider. The other thing to consider is that the early opponents of affirmative action said, okay, we'll do it for a generation. And in fact, there's language at the end of O'Connor's opinion in Grutter, where she says wistfully, well, I hope that we don't have to do this basically for another generation, which is actually undermines, I think, the strength of her opinion overall. You shouldn't put a time limit on it, because if you put a time limit on it, then you can have people have expectations and say, you see, we gave you 25 years. This is the kind of problem. Think about it. For 400 years, things have been out of whack. Why do you think you can address this problem in 25 years? Talk about a fool's errand. That's completely naive in that respect. So that's one thing to consider in this regard. I think there was something else, but I think I forgot about it. It'll probably come back to me. But I think what I'd rather do is probably stop talking and then let people ask questions later, and then let Renee go. So I'm passing the baton to Renee, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Olken, for that. I want to try to focus my comments on some of the themes that both Professor MC and Professor Olken already touched upon, and then try to make some connections about our history and then about today. I think by and large, what you hear us saying is that America has yet to reckon with its past, with racism, the way in which racism is insidious in all of our institutions, our public institutions and systems. And part of that is that, for example, I imagine that a lot of folks here were not even necessarily exposed, for example, even to some of the points of history, the policies, the laws, right, that Professor MC laid out. So just in thinking about what we're exposed to, what we're taught, what our shared understanding is of history, of how we came to be the United States of America, right, in itself is told from a very particular perspective, and leaves out the points of violence, of harm that were sanctioned by the state, that were inflicted upon by on Black bodies and by both institutions and individuals. We never actually have to talk about that. You're never typically exposed to that. Maybe in college and you're a history major, perhaps you hear some of this, but even in the way that the story is told, right, is the point, and the narratives that are created is really evidence of the way in which white supremacy exists in this country. And so I want to just try to hit a couple of points, and I'm going to try to be brief because I really want to hear from folks and hopefully have time for questions. But in thinking about the history of this country and where we come from, the fact of the matter is, from 1619 until 1865, the United States became a small colonial outpost to the largest economy in the world. And the reason for that was slavery. The reason for that was the fact that Black people, kidnapped, enslaved Africans were brought to this country and were subjected to torture, to free labor that really built the wealth of this country. And so everything that this country currently is partially due to the fact that the United States had at least 2.5 centuries of free labor to build its economy. And that is the initial point, right, of a transfer of really Black wealth to white folks in this country. In thinking about the labor that enslaved Africans were subjected to, and the sweat equity that they were forced to invest in this country, right, is the first point of a transfer of wealth that we continue to see through today. And I want to talk about what some of those contemporary examples look like. One of the things that, and maybe let me just make one other point about that. Professor MC talked about the ways in which post-slavery, the ways in which sabotage was used sometimes when there were successful Black businesses. We talk about the Tulsa massacre. There are many instances in which there was specific backlash on successful examples of Black community economic development. And the other part about that is that I want us to realize that the police have always been used as a tool for control, the control of, and in this sense, I'm not just speaking about Black bodies, but specifically about Black bodies. The police have always been used as a tool to control the labor force. And so in the South, the creation of the police force come from slave patrols. That is the origin point of policing as we know it in the South. In the North, the police more or less are a created institution in part to squash labor rebellions. right? So there's always been the threat of violence to control the labor force, or to force, in many cases, enslaved persons, right? To provide this investment of equity and value to create the wealth of this country. And while, again, like while it may have taken a particular form at that time, we still see examples of that today. One of the reasons why we talk so much about the dispossession of land or private property rights, which our systems of laws is based off of private property. This country is based off of the enjoyment of private property, is in part because wealth by and large has mostly been built by everyday Americans through the owning and through the use of property, right? And specifically land. So one of the things that we certainly need to talk about in thinking about the ways in which wealth, again, are transferred by and large from Black Americans, even today, to white Americans, is redlining, right? Redlining was a point, certainly, in which, and this is in the wake of the Great Depression and the start of basically the federal system that provides home loans or refinancing. The United States government specifically labeled Black neighborhoods, or neighborhoods where where Black folks lived, as too risky to provide a loan to provide a refinancing for. And this was not about how affluent those neighborhoods, there were certainly affluent neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods. This was all based upon race. And so what we see is that Black folks are less likely to get home loans. They're less likely to actually get a loan, for example, to even rehab their house or to fix up, let's say, their facade, all those things. And it carries through to today, and in all of the policies that we then come to see around home ownership. For example, the GI Bill is a good example of this. There were thousands of Black Americans who fought in the war, who were eligible for the GI Bill, but did not necessarily receive the benefits of that bill in the sense that they were unable to get a loan. So just by way of example, there were 27,000 some GI mortgage loans made available in the state of New York, and 100 of them were by Black Americans, right? Disproportionately not to the amount of Black Americans who were eligible for that program. And that is what we see again and again through the creation of HUD, through a lot of what we refer to as like community development programs. It's not only what the law says, but it's also the way in which the law is implemented in terms of who can access the rights. And that kind of brings me to what more or less has been a continued transfer of wealth from Black Americans to white Americans. So for example, Black Americans pay all the same taxes that white Americans do. They pay property taxes, they pay federal payroll taxes, they pay state taxes. Yet when we see how those tax dollars are distributed just on a local level, when we think about schools, when we think about access to public goods, we always know that, for example, let's just stick with schools, that Black neighborhoods will have less resource schools, certainly than white neighborhoods. And those are decisions that are made, right? When we think about, for example, access to public transportation, our collective tax dollars are then taken and decisions are made about what neighborhoods actually receive investment, what neighborhoods receive certain kinds of infrastructure to ensure that they actually have a stable local neighborhood economy where people have access to jobs. And so even when we think about today, the way it's not just gentrification in the sense that, oh, property values rise and then low income communities of color then get pushed out. It's a concerted effort about where investment goes. And then when we want to capture, or developers try to capture low affordable property or land, often it's the government that aids them. Sometimes they by big parcels of land for $1, and then they develop it in a very concerted way. And they use many tools, not just necessarily economic development, but things like the police. So in gentrifying neighborhoods, you see an increase of police presence, and that's intentional in part. You see sometimes the harassment of longtime residents, people of color. And so the landscape of both policies and laws in terms of how they're implemented continue to transfer wealth from Black communities to white communities, in the sense that we cannot capture in the same way the value that we might invest in housing. Professor MC started to talk about this, but there have been studies now where the same house has been assessed. And in the first case, the assessor is aware that it's, for example, a interracial couple, or they're aware that at least one Black person lives there. And in the second case, they are not aware. So they just think the house is owned strictly by a white family. And they have assessed that house from a difference of tens of thousands of dollars. So that is another way in which Black Americans can't necessarily capture wealth in the same way that white Americans can. So just a few things, because I don't want to speak for too long, but we do know that if we look at the same redlining maps that the United States created, those maps match up today to poverty, to police shootings, to under-resourced schools, almost perfectly. And my point in kind of hammering this home is that these are choices that were made. These are investments that continue to be made. It's not a coincidence that the boundaries of neighborhoods look the way that they do, that segregation currently exists in the form that it exists. And so, finally, just to try to wrap up, on average, Black homes are valued about $50,000 less than white homes that are similar in terms of the house itself. The Black community has lost more than $156 billion cumulatively in property values. And even those who actually decide to become entrepreneurial. So let's say, one of the ways in which I think entrepreneurship is used is that, well, if you can't find a good paying job, create your own opportunity. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We know that Black businesses are less likely to get a loan, less likely to have access to capital. And even in thinking about a more recent program, right? So the PPP program, we know that the majority of businesses that are going to close are going to be minority-owned businesses. We know that while the folks who applied in terms of white-owned businesses, they had a 60% success rate. Black-owned businesses had a 30% success rate of actually receiving a PPP loan. And we also know that they're much more likely to be at risk right now and to be distressed in this moment as we've gone through the shutdown. So Black-owned businesses are about 6 times more likely to close in the wake of COVID and going through this process. So those are the things I want to pick up on. But what I really want, I hope you take away from is that it's not just what happened, it's currently what's in place. It's how our systems function. And it's not always just what the law says, it's also how it's implemented. It's the decisions that are made, not only in terms of a federal or state policy, but also how public resources, how taxpayer dollars are invested in neighborhoods, or how neighborhoods are neglected, or sometimes how Black and brown communities are intentionally dispossessed of their neighborhood, so they can gentrify and make way, right, for more affluent white communities and housing. So I'll stop there. and hopefully we can have more of a conversation to talk a little bit more about some of this.
Thank you so much, both Professors Olken and Hatcher. Excellent comments. So we'll open it up for questions now. Are there any questions in the chat, or if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question? So as you're formulating your questions, I'll ask a question. So for Professor Hatcher, could you talk about ways that you've organized communities in order to recognize and capitalize on their own wealth, and how to make their wealth a real possibility in moving the community forward and making it a place that has resources for everyone?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of really amazing work that people are doing in their own communities to build wealth collectively, to think about ways in which reinvestment can happen, or just like people in their own neighborhood can have more agency over what their neighborhood looks like, what their community looks like. And so some of the things that we work on in the clinic, for example, are helping residents or neighborhood associations start things like community land trusts, where the community can come together and actually collectively own land, develop affordable housing, make sure that it's permanently affordable, and really be intentional about the ways in which people have access to quality affordable housing. Or for example, a lot of our clients have had experiences in the mainstream economy where they've been exploited. Every week, for example, workers lose $7 million in wage theft. So these are wages that they've earned, but they're not paid. And so the types of exploitation that we see, a lot of times our clients have faced, right, either experiences of worker exploitation or wage theft in the mainstream economy. And then they band together to start a cooperative where they're basically owning the business and they're working in the business. They own their own labor. They get to make decisions directly about their working conditions. And also, they get to create their business in the ways that actually work best for them and for their community. So there's lots of things that we do. A lot of what we try to think about is like, how can we provide legal support to organizations, for-profits, residents, more or less, to ensure that they have access to build the kinds of communities that they want, to do really collective wealth building, to make sure, for example, that their dollar is turning over in their own local communities and not simply leaving the community or neighborhood immediately.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. Professor Olken, could you speak to, the recent efforts to kind of reframe history, kind of the backlash to the 1619 project, and, the president's executive order? You spoke about education and the law school kind of being really integral to the fight of inclusive education. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I guess basically in fairly general terms. Let me just preface this with anything that the president says or does, I would ignore. He is in many respects the embodiment of the worst in this country. I read the other day that one of his targets, or the education department's targets, is Princeton, because the president of Princeton, who was a former constitutional law professor, Chris Eisgruber, had written a letter to the Princeton community where he in part had apologized for some of the things that had gone on in Princeton for centuries. Princeton has always had a reputation of being a fairly sort of socially exclusive, a fantastic university, but socially exclusive. And he was very apologetic for that, and explained in part why they removed the Woodrow Wilson's name from the Woodrow Wilson School. I think this idea of the reaction to the 1619 project and the Trump administration's sort of inglorious attempts to sort of roll back history, et cetera. For some reason, the idea that people want an opportunity that has been denied to them for now 4+ centuries seems to be completely appalling to them, and puts them on the defensive. And what they don't, I think, understand is that in a nation that was supposedly founded in part to promote liberty, you're not doing that if you're keeping people back. If your legal systems, your economic systems are used in such a way that you're basically either ossifying, or which is bad, or you're just using it as Renee so elegantly laid out in her talk, you're constantly using it to keep people in their place. And by doing that, you're bringing down all of America. You have to look at the universities as being sort of the lifeblood of a democracy. And the more, as I said before, the more diverse they are, the more rich they are, the better they'll be, the more they will function. What I forgot to say before that I remembered listening to Renee, she inspired me there, is one of the things that's important in a democracy is obviously power is important, but there's different kinds of power. And if you subscribe to the theory that knowledge is power, then you don't want to put any impediments into the acquisition of knowledge. And that's really why affirmative action should remain in place on all segments of society in order to facilitate the democratic experiment. If you don't, if you have to remove the impediments that have been there. They're cultural, they're social, they seem to be almost unfortunately in the DNA of this country. And some of the comments that I sometimes hear about from people who are opponents of affirmative action is like, well, what do they need now? You know, they got the 13th Amendment, they got the 14th Amendment, they got the 15th Amendment. And it's like, are you kidding me? What they don't see, what people don't seem to understand is that for 400 years in this country, we've had affirmative action. Affirmative action has existed in large part for people who look like me. Okay, that's where affirmative action has existed in this country. And it's embarrassing for me to say it. It's embarrassing for some of you probably to hear it, but it's true. And the fact of the matter is that we have to dismantle that system, and we have to realize that it's not working, and that the worst thing that you can do to people is deprive them of hope. And the other thing to understand, and I spent a lot of time this summer talking about this with people and thinking about it, is anybody who thinks that there is a divide between economic inequality and racial inequality. And what I mean by divide is, let me be more precise. If you don't think that there's a relationship between them, I don't know what rock you've been living under, but it is completely impossible to take those away. In 1965, Daniel Patrick Moynihan was a professor of government at Harvard, so long before he was a Democratic senator from New York. And he was commissioned by President Lyndon B. Johnson to do a study on poverty in America. And one of the things that then Professor Moynihan pointed out in his report is that you have got to address the impediments that are placed in people's places in the inner cities, the structural impediments, the economic impediments, the legal impediments. Until you address those, you're never going to have the great society. That's what Lyndon Baines Johnson was trying to create. And he reached out in a very un-Trump-like fashion to an expert in the field and asked Professor Moynihan, how do we address this? I grew up in Philadelphia, and one of the things that always struck me as very odd and poignant about Philadelphia was there was an entire segment of the city known as North Philadelphia. which is block after block after block. Temple University, for example, is in the heart of North Philadelphia. The great boxer, late boxer, Joe Frazier, had his gym in North Philadelphia, across from the Amtrak station that my family and I used to always use to go to New York and Baltimore to visit our family. And I always would ask my parents, how come, and this was in the 70s and in the 80s, why is it that North Philadelphia has never been basic? Why is it rotting? And they could never give me an answer. And even now, every summer, except this past summer because of COVID, I spend a week to 10 days in Philadelphia, and I walk all around, and I go to North Philadelphia. People say, don't go to North Philadelphia, it's dangerous, etc. And I'm like, yeah, I'll be fine. I can't, it still hurts me that my city, the city that I was raised in, has basically let an entire segment of it die. And in large part of that is the outright racism of the Rizzo administration. For example, some of you might have seen in the news that Frank Rizzo's statue was taken down. Thank God. Philadelphia is a horrible, horrible mayor, a horrible man. And you see this, and that's why if you're going to, in one segment of society, you can do this relatively easy in higher education. And I also believe that the more diverse your classrooms are, the more diverse your workplaces are, the more easy it is going to be for people to confront racism and talk about it and move forward together. And it's going to disabuse people of various stereotypes. We can't keep on in separate societies, segregated societies. We will be doomed to failure as a democracy. So that's probably a little more than you wanted, Teri, I guess, in terms of my answer. But
No,
Yeah.
absolutely not. It was wonderful. Professor Hatcher, you had some other comments to add?
Yeah, so I was just going to pick up on something Professor Olken just said. So in thinking about, for example, affirmative action, right, and who affirmative action has been through, I wanted to just quickly give an example. So Michael Harriot, who writes for The Root, talks about this particular example in South Carolina. And in 1950, 40% of the population of South Carolina was Black. Black schools, all of the schools specifically for Black students at that time were worth about $12.9 million, while white schools were worth around $68.4 million. Right. And so that's the type of not only affirmative action, but transfer of wealth. And then take that one step further. Right. At that time, while white students obviously were going to better resource schools, they also, when they graduated, could go on to, I think, one of 5 colleges, state colleges that existed at that time. At that time, they were not admitting Black students into any state colleges. However, just as the white citizens of South Carolina at the time were paying taxes, so were Black citizens. And they did not have the benefit of the tax dollars that they were paying in the same way that those white South Carolinians had. So that is the type of affirmative action. That is the type of racism that we're talking about. It's structural, and and even in thinking about what we think of as affirmative action today, the largest beneficiary of affirmative action has been white women, and so that more or less just I'm hoping people understand it's not only the policies, right, or what the law says, it's also how it's implemented. And then I just wanted to pick up on a question because I think it's a really good one, and not necessarily one that I always have the answer to, but someone asked in the chat box about how do you deal or talk to people who aren't educated on these topics, but have very loud opinions, right? And I think that goes back to one thing that I was trying to make the point about earlier is that the narratives that were told, the stories that were told, the way in which history is crafted and talked about in this country, or just generally in our public education system, right, to me is indicative of white supremacy in terms of whose story gets told, how it gets told, who more or less is seen as the protagonist, and the story and the types of stereotypes that are crafted particularly around people of color, around anti-Blackness, around thinking about Latinx Americans as well, or Mexican Americans. And it goes on and on down the line. All of those stereotypes, right? The source of that is white supremacy. But in trying to deal with this, there's a quote that I love by John Henry Clark, and he basically says, "I only debate my equals, all others I teach." And part of what we need to think about, right, is not necessarily extinguishing a conversation with those who haven't been exposed to this history, or sometimes who have very loud and harmful opinions that are patently false or rooted in white supremacy or crafted narratives or stereotypes about people of color. And the question for me is always, what's the context to engage, and how much energy in any given moment do I have to engage? Because that too, I think, is an important part of it. But what we need to do as much as possible, and those of us obviously who are in the academy or who are teachers, but also in all of our institutions, just thinking also, how do we start to really tell the whole of the story, and not just from one particular perspective, right?
We're at time, but we have one more question that I think is important and would be great to wrap us up. So for both of you, what do you see as the responsibility of law professors in educating students responsibly in the way that we've been talking about today? What is our responsibility and our obligations to our students? And more specifically, the way the question was asked and Professor Ricardo poses, what are the responsibilities of law professors to educate our students about the truths about white supremacist ideology throughout and inscribed in U.S. legal history?
Well, for me, I think it's incumbent upon us to, one of the things that infuriated me in law school was this notion that the law was objective, and not only its substance, but also its application. Because we would read cases that were so clearly wrapped up in race and racism, and there would be no mention of race, right? I think one of the things that we have to do is to be willing to have those hard conversations. The difficulty in that is that we have not ever really had to have those conversations before. Chances are you didn't do that in elementary school, middle school, high school, maybe college, maybe, depends. Most people, I would think not, but maybe you were exposed to some type of course or materials that really made you think about race or history, or how racism has played such a huge role in this country, in our society. And so it's so difficult. It is very difficult to now in law school, when everybody's coming into the classroom with different points of reference, with different baseline understandings about some of these issues, to have a real conversation about race and racism in the law. However, it's not impossible. And I think part of what we can do, I think part of our responsibility, is to talk honestly about the ways in which the law also, right, racism is pervasive in the law, or the realities sometimes, and sometimes it's very clear. I mean, the Getz case, how do you not talk about race if you're teaching the Getz case in crim law? How do you not talk about race? How do you not talk about the massacre of indigenous people, the dispossession of indigenous people, if you teach property? Because what we're doing if we don't talk about race is actually making a choice to reinforce white supremacy, to not tell the truth of it, to not tell the whole story. And so I think that's where we start. And it's not easy, again, because we haven't really had to have conversations about race as a society, and many times in educational institutions. But I definitely think it's incumbent upon us in at the very least in how we are honestly providing material.
I don't really have a lot to add to what Renee said. I agree 100% with her. In many respects, it's easier for me to do it because of the courses I teach. I mean, I teach constitutional law, I teach constitutional history, I teach constitutional theory. It's pretty hard to avoid not talking about those subjects in those courses. But I also think that in the last, I'd say, decade or so, I've made the conscious choice and decision as a older professor to speak out more in the classroom than I would have 20 years ago. And I've done that because I realize that I'm a role model, for better or for worse. And I realize that there's a certain shock value when an older white guy can come right out and basically, call out the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court in an 11th Amendment case and say, well, it's pretty clear this case involved Black people and he didn't want to hear it. And he came up with a way to basically dismiss the case. And at first I had some trepidation doing it. And then after doing it a while, I realized that I was actually getting more people's attention and more interest, drawing more interest from people than I would have if I'd just been my normal sort of dry self. But I think that context is so important in every aspect of the law. And I too remember sitting in some of my law school classes and thinking there is more to the story than they're telling us, basically. And then once I started teaching a few years after leaving law school, I was, and then you start researching on your own, you realize, oh my God, there's a lot more of the story. I mean, eventually, these cases, whatever course you're teaching, they're about people. And that means that there's lots of stories that you can tell about the case and to put it in a context. But I also believe that my students should be using the law not simply to make money, but maybe to promote some social good, and that they should look at themselves as like natural science engineers or social science engineers, that they're using the law as a way that a computer scientist would use math. They're using the law in a similar way to promote good and or try to encourage them in that respect. But I never ever wanted them to just simply memorize the rules. I don't think the rules make any sense by themselves. You have to put them in a broader context. And by teaching constitutional law now for 3 decades, it's all about policy. It's all about public policies. And how can you not tell the story? You always want to get it's like being a journalist. You always want to get the facts right. You want to get the truth out. You're not doing anybody any good if you're only telling part of the truth. And so in that respect, I do think that regardless of what we teach, our students watch us, they listen to us, they remind us years later of things that we said in the classroom that we forgot that we said, and we are their role models. And because of the role that the law plays in society and the role that we play in our students' lives, we would be doing them a disservice if we're not basically laying it all out on the line for them and exposing them to as much as possible, and not trying to protect their feelings or if they feel uncomfortable or something of that nature. I mean, the biggest compliment that I've gotten from students is when I'm doing affirmative action, and I spend an entire week in my Con Law 2 class on that, is well, I'll have students come to my office hours and very quietly say, Professor Olken, you didn't necessarily change my mind, but you got me to think about things differently. I mean, that's the biggest compliment that I can get, basically. And I do think we are role models. Maybe we're reluctant role models, and they have to know the entire story. And for so long, so much of that story hasn't been told. And because it hasn't been told, or people don't want to hear about it, we're now at a point where we are exploding as a society. People have had enough, and it's understandable why people are angry etc. But if these people that we're teaching are going to be lawyers, then they need to know basically that being a lawyer is more than simply knowing the answer. It's you really, Renee, you said this beautifully before about the law, and that it's not simply the words on a page. I'm pretty much paraphrasing from you, but it's how it's implemented. That's the key. It's the implementation. That's the perspective from which somebody, whether it's a judge or whether it's a lawyer or whether it's somebody in an administrative agency, and the best lawyers are the ones who understand that context and know that it's about storytelling. And that's all I got for you at this point. There'll be more later, probably.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you both for your such incisive remarks, so eloquently stated. And I'm so happy that we had a chance to have this conversation, and I'm looking forward to many more. Dean Luma, did you have any closing remarks?
No, thank you to all for this program. I think it's very important to continue putting our voices and having conversations like this in the law school community and creating spaces for this kind of dialogue. So thank you.
And with that, I think we're at an end. Bye-bye, everyone.